Well, welcome to the Grace Podcast. This is episode number, what episode is this?
3.
This is episode number 3. Welcome to the third episode of the Grace Podcast. And I'm here with Dylan Gouws, who is the current online or digital campus pastor here at Grace. And you may or may not know, Dylan and his wife Ash are actually immigrating to the UK very shortly. And we thought I'd love to just get an interview in with Dylan before he heads off. And I know, Dylan, you've got so much value to add. And I know that today this podcast is going to be really, really helpful. So just to give you some context, we're in this series. If you've been watching on Sunday, you don't have to have watched, but we're in this series looking at the life of Joseph. And the series is called Dare to Dream. And we've looked at Joseph in the pit. We've looked at Joseph in the prison. And we've been looking at Joseph in the palace. And I spoke on Sunday around how Joseph kind of used his influence, used his platform to do good, not just for himself, but for others. And what it kind of really struck me as I was kind of researching the story is that this is actually a story about spiritual maturity. A young boy, 17-year-old boy who kind of unwisely shares his dreams with his brothers, and that gets him into trouble, kind of track the story all the way through ups and downs to this sort of wise and gracious leader who in a moment is able to override his kind of emotions of wanting to exact revenge on his brothers, and he's able to extend forgiveness. And there's something powerful about that moment, and it changes the fate of not just his brothers or him, but actually of an entire nation. So I spoke a little bit about spiritual maturity. If you missed the message, I really encourage you to go back. And the title of my message was literally Grow Up, what Joseph can teach us about spiritual maturity. And there's some great life lessons in Joseph's story. But I want to hear from Dylan today around this topic of spiritual maturity. And Dylan, I know when I asked you to talk about this, you're kind of like, why me? I don't, you're a fairly young guy, not as young as you once were. But what can I say about spiritual maturity? But from my side, I think as I've worked alongside you and walked with you in your own journey, I've seen incredible growth in your life. And it's been amazing to watch you grow as a leader, as a husband, but also just as a follower of Christ in your own faith. So I'd love to just start by asking you, what do you think spiritual maturity is? What does it look like? Or maybe how would you define spiritual maturity?
Yeah, Tom, I think we don't actually ever arrive at being spiritually mature. I'd say there's no end goal. I think the way I like to look at it is there's the spectrum, and we only ever becoming more spiritually mature. I think if I had to say there's an end goal, I would say Jesus is the end goal of what it means to be spiritually mature. And the reality is we never actually reach that, but we become more like Jesus. So to answer your question, I would say I think spiritual maturity is directly proportional to how we imitate Jesus. I love what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11. He just says, you should imitate me just as I imitate Christ. And if we consider, like, Paul's quite I would say spiritually mature when you read all the letters he's wrote, but he's not Jesus. And if he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ, I'm kind of going to listen to the guy who is more spiritually mature than me. So I would say to imitate Jesus, the more you imitate Jesus, the more spiritually mature you are.
Sure, that's great. It's so simple and yet so hard to do. I mean, even Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, like you say, he still writes, Romans 7, it's like, I want to do what's right, but I don't. And so even he acknowledges, that he messes up. But I love that thing of it's constant and it's ongoing, So I think, growing up, when we speak about growing up, we speak about, growing up as a child or growing up in South Africa, what it was like, whatever. But from a spiritual maturity point of view, like, what do you think in our culture or in our world, or even maybe right now in this cultural moment, what do you think prevents growth or is maybe stunting people's growth? Or what are the factors in our culture or in our world that sort of limit spiritual growth or maybe even produce immature maturity in us? What do you see? How do you see that?
So I see quite a few in our culture, and I can speak as a person in my generation and what really impacts us. But there's two things I kind of want to touch on. I think the first one that really stunts our growth is distraction. I think we're living in a time where things are competing for our focus, and it wants to pull us. Those things want to pull us away from growing spiritually and growing spiritually mature. So I mean, these things like phones, social media, politics, and so on, there's so many different things that are actually diverting our attention to focus on them that we're missing out on actually growing spiritually. Now, these things I don't think are actually bad. I think it just depends on the relationship that we have with them. I mean, phones aren't bad. Social media is not bad. Politics, I mean, it isn't bad. It's supposed to be good. But I think depending on the relationship that we have with them, it can either distract us. They can either be a stumbling block or they can be a stepping stone. So what I mean by that is as a stumbling block, we can allow it to divert us, to distract us, or we could use these things, steward them well in order to help us on our spiritual journey. I mean, if we look at an example, a modern day one, I'll use one like my phone. So my phone is a distraction, but the YouVersion Bible app on there is something that actually helps me in my spiritual maturity and growth, because I'll read scripture, I can check devotions, I can go in depth and see what other people are saying. And it has the opportunity to make me stumble because it's on my phone, or it gives me the opportunity to use it as a stepping stone to become more like Christ. So I would say that's...
I love that. And I think that's like it's like everything we've created. I mean, everything created in and of itself, money is not in and of itself bad, but it's the love of money. Technology is not bad. Technology has helped us advance and do incredible things, help people, medical, all that stuff. It's how we use that technology that determines whether it can be good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. I love that analogy you say, like my phone. I know it's a struggle for all of us, the dopamine hits of getting likes and, the way that can kind of pull us astray, or we spend hours scrolling. I mean, these are platforms designed to keep our attention. We talk about an attention economy. But at the same time, for me, I've been mentored through books that I've read through Audible, and I have my Bible in my pocket, and I'm able to, and I'm following people that provide inspiration and hope. So as you say, it's almost like a double-edged sword, and it's how we so what do you think helps us to handle these distractions or things in our world well, as opposed to bad?
Like I said,
have you got like a discipline routine? Like, do you have like a digital well-being that like kicks you off Instagram after an hour, or how do you control that?
I don't think I'm as disciplined as you, Tom, where you have the digital well-being. My wife will say, well, how long have you been playing that game on your phone? And she's been my digital well-being. But funny enough, I think the key word is discipline, and we've chatted about it in person quite a lot, and setting up good boundaries. So for me, I'm too scared to go look at how long I've spent on an app, because I know that I'm probably spending too much time there. But I think one of the ways that's really helped me is just to remove it. I think some people are better at having boundaries and having a relationship with the thing and being able to set times. But for me, I'm the kind of person, I need to just remove it from my life so that I don't go and like play that game. So I actually had to remove a game on my phone that I was playing all the time. And to justify it, I was like, oh, I'm in the top 1,000 in South Africa. I'm doing so well. But I had to actually get rid of it because it was pulling me away from engaging with scripture or wanting to grow in my spiritual maturity. Gaming's fun. It's cool.
Or just spending time with people. I mean, let alone outside of the growing thing, just, the people that matter most,
Exactly. So I think the best thing to do is, you have to set up boundaries and discipline. Like you said, you can do digital well-being things where you only allow certain times on your phone, or you can just remove certain things altogether. Now, that might not always be the best way, but I guess it depends on your personality type.
Well, I think sometimes we have to be ruthless. And I know this is kind of going in a different direction in terms of, and we'll come back to this idea of spiritual growth. But, the Bible says if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And sometimes we try like soften the blow of those words, or Jesus didn't really mean that. But, I think, I know for me, like as someone before becoming a follower of Christ, and I've shared some of this fairly vulnerably, like, for me, pornography was like a major kind of addictive thing. And it had me thinking in all the wrong kinds of ways about sexuality, about women. And I unfortunately, even, after becoming a Christian, sort of brought some of that thinking into my marriage. And it took years to unwind some of that. And so, for me, like, and that's obviously not a problem that I've struggled with for a long, long time. But I also know that, the enemy stands at the door and knocks, and I'm a human being with flesh and blood, and that temptation is still always present. And I've got to be very, very intentional about how I set up boundaries and controls that, because this thing has the potential to ruin my life. So I think we joke about, taking a game off, and that's one, but this can actually have real ramifications as we speak about it. So that's cool. So the other thing, I know I chatted to you a bit before some of the questions we were going to talk about, and maybe this is like a controversial one, but millennials, I think you fall into that age group. Is that right? I never know when these generations start and finish. But millennials have been often labeled as entitled. Do you think that that's a fair label as a millennial yourself? Do you think that it's unfair? What do you think?
Talk about controversial. Okay, well, like you said, there's so many people with different research out there, but I'm going to share from my experience of being a millennial. I do think we're entitled. I really do. And I think it's fair? Yes and no. I think it's fair because we are, but I also don't think it's fair because that's the label that we keep getting given to us, and people just keep seeing us through that lens. So when you hear the word millennial, let's be honest, the synonym that you think of is entitled. Like, people don't really think of another word. Well, that's in my experience. Now, I mean, it's so easy for me to have a go at other generations, but and
they don't say creative, innovative, entrepreneurial, and all the other factors that have been associated.
Well, exactly, and I think that's exactly it. And like I was saying, I think it's so easy for us to then go and say to other generations, "Oh, you've got it wrong." But all the generations just keep chirping each other, and then it ends up being this huge blame game. So what if they saw, like you're saying, instead of seeing us as just entitled, seeing us as creative and innovative? I mean, I read a study as I was prepping for this. It was a study in 2015, and I'll find the link, but I want to read it. They actually said, I try to find what is a positive thing about entitlement, because I've never actually heard a positive thing about this word. And it says this, it says, a sense of entitlement can actually lead to one surprisingly positive outcome, and that is increased creativity. Entitled people are unapologetic about getting what they want when they want, without regard for anyone else. Now, I don't literally agree with the latter part, because that feels like you'll just run over anyone to get what you want. But what if we could shift the perspective and look at millennials as, well, they're willing to do whatever it takes to get what they want or what they need? And how do we channel that into a good space? Because if we keep saying, "Oh, you're entitled, we're just going to keep pushing us millennials into a box that's who we are, and we fight back. Versus, are people taking us under their wing and helping us to actually see the good in it? Because also, the reality is we've been conditioned and brought up to believe, like you say, we're a unique unicorn. We can do anything in the world, and we deserve it. We're entitled to it. Give it to us on a silver platter. But the world doesn't actually work that way. And now we've been conditioned this way. And then years later, we're being told it's wrong. So it's this tension that we're trying to figure out. So what kind of long story short, I think, yes, we're entitled. But I don't think, it can be used for good. I think everything can be redeemed for good. And I also, if I could say something to millennials,
and life has a way of knocking entitlement out of you.
I agree. I mean, you've told us that,
because I think, as you say, a lot of this is a general. It's like you were told, the world is your oyster. You can be anything you want. Go out and get it. Sort of the American dream. And then suddenly, the world isn't your oyster, and you're not that good at that. And you thought you could sing on pop idols, but you're actually not a good singer. And so I think there is a reality check that comes in. I think for me, I want to focus a little bit on, because you're saying that if there is a truth to that label, the thing is, how does that prevent growth? Because I think for me, if I had to say like spiritual maturity, honestly, like in some ways, like I've had this conversation so much, like what is spiritual formation, and this is what we're going to do. And I found like I've grown the most through two things, and that is through action, through actually like just working out how to do stuff and growing through experience. And then the other one is just pain.
Yeah.
And I think we've spoken about that over the past season as we've looked at the life of Joseph. Like, he wouldn't have been able to act the way he did in the palace if he hadn't had the pit and the prison. And I think for me, so often we actually stunt or we shortchange our maturity because we just want to get to the palace, and that's not just a millennial thing. That's we all get to the good part. We want to get to the end, that we want to have 10,000 followers, or we want to have the house and with all the appliances, but actually our parents never had that. Your parents never had that. And everyone's got pain in their life. And so I think for me, what I see in Joseph's life, and I see it throughout the scriptures. And when I think of people who I would consider mature, every single one of them has experienced significant setback and pain.
Mm-hmm.
And they've framed that not as, oh, sorry, woe is me, but rather, this is a part of life. How am I going to use that experience to make me a better person? And Joseph wrestled with that. I mean, he didn't want to forgive his brother straight up. He wrestled. But in the end, his maturity won out. And I think it was born out of pain,
Yeah.
So I just want to say, Dill, and then I'm going to ask you one more question, and I know you want to say something, but I want to say, like, for me, like, having seen you, and I know maybe you fit in that bracket of millennial, but I honestly I think you're one of the most teachable guys that I know. And I think since you've been part of our Grace family as an intern, as as someone just as an attendee, and then now on staff, now leading a campus, I think part of the reason you've been given more and more responsibility is because you've shown yourself faithful in little things. And I think you've been teachable, you've been humble. I'm sure you've thought many times, oh, these guys don't know what they're doing, or I have better solutions. But you've held your tongue, or I think that's incredible. So I think for me, that's why I wanted to interview you today, because I think you've modeled humility. I think you've modeled, and I think that's helped you to grow, because you've gone into every conversation. Instead of when you received feedback, some of the feedback you've received hasn't been good. But instead of saying, oh, how can they say that about me? You've said, okay, well, what truth is there in this, and how do I grow from it? And then you've actually come out better preacher, better communicator, better leader. So I think so much of it maturity hinges around our willingness to take feedback and our willingness to actually humble ourselves. And I want to just commend you on that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I think exactly what you're saying links to a moment that we had, where I was questioning whether I should be the digital campus pastor. I don't know if you remember that. And we met, and I said, I don't think this is for me. And you said, well, I think you have a year or two in you to do this and get it done, and like to push through it, because so often, like you said, we want to skip to the good part. We want for me, it would have been the studio. I would have had the staff. I would have had the resource, and it was tough. And so often, or to link it to the millennial thing, is when we don't get what we want, we jump ship and we go somewhere else. And we never actually get to walk through pain and develop grit and perseverance. And that was a conversation that you had with me. And I'm so glad that you did, because I think the only way that you really grow is through pain. Look at Paul again in scripture. I mean, he went through a lot. And Jesus went through a lot. Shipwreck
after shipwreck.
Exactly. I would hate to have been Paul. So yeah, I agree with those 2 points that you made. I don't really have to add on to that. I think you're 100% right.
Yeah, great. So the last question I want to ask, Dylan, thanks again for being on the podcast. We will miss you, and I know this is not the last time we're going to be seeing you, but for those who watch online or who have called the digital campus their home, you really have been their pastor for the past while. And I think you've done an incredible job of building teams and caring for people near and far. And that's quite tricky, caring for people in a digital space. And I think you've done that incredibly well. And so I know you're going to be deeply missed here as you head off, but we're super excited for you and Ash and the next season that you're heading towards, and the church that you're going to be part of. And we've been praying for you and praying for a soft landing. And we just know you're going to do an incredible thing there. So that's my little, I get to say it on camera. I know I'll say it again in a different space, but so maybe if you are watching, comment. If you can comment wherever you're watching, just your appreciation for Dylan and Ash, and our prayers for you guys. But the last question I want to ask you is, what areas do you feel like you still need to grow? Maybe the most, maybe 1 or 2 areas. And what have you found that has helped you in your growth? I know we've spoken about pain and all that, but are there any practices that you have instituted in your life that have helped you to grow spiritually?
So to answer the first part of your question, I think one of the things that I really need to work on that affects my growth is worrying what people think the whole time. So the problem with that is when I start worrying what people think, I start to allow them to dictate where I should grow. I mean, we've chatted around bonsai trees and stuff, and you get to shape where it grows. And I feel like if you let just anyone shape where you grow, you could not survive. So I think that's very important, and that actually links to one of the practices I've got 2 practices.
The fear of man.
The fear of man. Yeah. It leads to 2 practices. The first one is actually mentorship, aka discipleship in Christian circles. I think for me, one of the one of the cornerstones that have really helped me grow is to be able to, I've had the privilege of having so many mentors just being in the grace environment. And I've had different mentors for different things. I've had mentors for preaching, for communication, for spiritual accountability, just for a normal accountability and different things. And I've been so grateful because you guys have poured into that. And I think in today's day and age, we're lacking mentorship because older people don't necessarily want to mentor younger people because they don't want to listen. And then younger people don't want to go to older people because, one, they don't know how to. And two, they just think, well, what do they know? They've messed up the world. Why should we listen to them? And I think that's such a big thing. It's such a big thing. So I think mentorship's key. Go find a mentor, take them to coffee, make a plan to see them. They have something to offer. And I think they will enjoy it because they get to share with what God's put on their heart. And then the second one, is you mentioned it, was being teachable and willing to learn. I haven't got it right. I feel like I'm always learning, always growing, and I have to fail and knock my head in doing so. But some of the best advice that you guys had ever given me was to be teachable and to hold my tongue and to learn, whether it's good or bad, the decisions that are being made, because I can learn from either or. So to be malleable and be able to learn, you can essentially eat the meat and spit out the bones, and you will grow in maturity as long as you're feeding from someone that is spiritually mature. So who is doing that is important. Those would be my two key practice things to do.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well done, Dill. Again, just to say, I think you really have shown, I think, incredible spiritual maturity in how you have handled yourself and the way you've grown and learned and shifted, and you guys haven't had it all easy, and you've had to COVID and changing wedding dates and moving to a new country. There's a whole challenge to that. So but I just want to say we're sending our love and our prayers with you guys, and I know I speak on behalf of the staff here at Grace, but also the digital Grace family. We're so excited for this next season, and we know that with that kind of attitude and that heart, you're going to continue to grow and continue to have an influence on many, many people. So thanks for joining us, guys, for the Grace podcast. That wraps up episode 3. Don't miss next week's episode. They come out every week on a Tuesday. And then we've got 10 with Tom, kind of where we explore faith 10 minutes at a time right here in my office. And it kind of unpacks some of the sermon thoughts. And if you missed any of this sermon, I really encourage you to go back. This Dare to Dream series has been wonderful. And so thanks so much for joining us again. And we'll see you all next time.